The Power Panel has been listening in, and they join me now to weigh in on what they heard there. Andrew Thompson is a former NDP cabinet minister in Saskatchewan. Jamie Ellerton is a former Conservative staffer. Shachi Kurl is the president of the Angus Reid Institute. And here with me in studio, Michelle Cadario was deputy chief of staff to former Prime Minister Paul Martin. So lots to unpack there, a lot coming out of that news conference. Of course, he's announcing today sort of a multi-billion-dollar package on food security, new money to build food terminals, new money to upgrade kind of agricultural interests in this country. But of course, so many of the questions from our fellow reporters today about Canada-US, about the bridge, that Gordie Howe bridge that seems to be stymied by the Americans. He's conceding today that the reason why that artery between Windsor and Detroit is not going ahead is because of a request from the Americans. He says there's some technical things to sort through between the two sides. So at the request of the Americans, Canada is not going ahead with that $6.4 billion bridge, at least for now. Many questions about Kuzma as well, where the talks stand between the two sides as to whether we can get to a deal with the Americans by that July 1st deadline for a review. Let's just kind of go wherever you want with this, folks, because there's lots to unpack there. Andrew, I'll start with you. What stood out to you as you heard the Prime Minister there? Obviously, a bit on the defensive about where things are with the Americans, but also not providing necessarily very clear answers as to why this key bridge is not going ahead now.
Well, there were two big things that I thought came across throughout the conversation. One is that he was at pains to make the point about the difference between the Americans' view from an administration and President Trump's view, and that these often run in parallel. Sometimes they diverge, but that he was attempting to say that the government is active on both of those. And there are often files where the Americans are engaged from an administration standpoint, but don't actually have Trump's attention. Those seem to be areas where we can make progress and work our way through. The Trump question is a wild card. And I thought one of the interesting things about what he was saying today is that, they're aware of that, and there's a great dynamic kind of at play within the United States that obviously Canadian negotiators are being mindful of, both with the upcoming midterms, questions around Trump's health, who will take them into the 28 election. All of these things are obviously on the timeline as Canada is kind of thinking in a bigger, longer arc than simply whatever the short-term American ideals are. Second piece I'll just say that I thought was interesting is just the degree of kind of technocratic emphasis that this government had, both in its policy outlines, but also the detail the Prime Minister was able to go into on a number of these issues. Certainly a big difference from the word salad stuff we were used to with the previous Prime Minister, very different than the kind of truly banal commentary that we're getting out of the Conservative opposition at this point. And so it was a very interesting kind of contrast of where things have been and where things are going, and I think it gives us a better sense of really of kind of where Mark Carney's head is at and where this Liberal administration is going.
Yeah, Michelle, I mean, as we understand it, the Prime Minister is essentially involved in every major issue that's crossing the desk of this government right now. I mean, what I heard, some sources were telling me he was tinkering with the social media ban as of, hours before it was going to go public. And obviously, as you hear his remarks today, he is so engaged really personally on these issues. What's interesting is that he will have some FaceTime, right, with Trump when he sits down with him at the G7 in Evian, France, where David Cochran, the normal host of this show, is headed. We're going to talk to him a little later. He's going to have some FaceTime, which he hasn't had in person since October. Do you think that's a real critical meeting at this juncture? Maybe the answer is obvious, but there are so many outstanding issues between our two countries. Things might move ahead, as he gets the chance to sit down with them.
Well, I thought, not to get ahead of ourselves, but I thought there was a thread of optimism in some of the discussions and some of the things that the Prime Minister was saying. Speaking about Minister LeBlanc and some kind of positive conversations that he's had. And I think Andrew was right that wanting to very much distance, any kind of idea that it was the president that was slowing down this bridge thing. I truly do believe it is just, it is much more of a technical kind of thing. And, let's not forget, he has referenced, not just today, but in the past, that they text. It's not like they haven't been in contact,
for sure,
right? And I think that also, given what's going on in the world, they're probably in more contact than perhaps a Canadian Prime Minister and an American President have been in quite some time. It's another thing to engage and to engage deeply. They're not going to have their full kind of trade teams there in France. But I think that one-on-one discussion is probably going to be important. The other thing that, my major takeaway just kind of does lean into this trade stuff is, as Andrew was saying, but he's really leaning into the nerdy stuff, right? The numbers and kind of going deep, but also shooting for the long term and making no apologies about it. Not pretending that there's going to be some kind of a quick fix, but that, the work actually has to be done. And I think that's how his approach to trade too. Work is done so that the benefits come later.
Yeah, even on this
long term.
Yeah, even on this food stuff, right?
Exactly.
Like he's talking about multi-billion-dollar investments here over 10 years. Asked, well, okay, well, what's that going to do for people now? But he says, well, we got to start to do some of these things if we're going to see improved food security, right? So he's obviously leaning into kind of the medium, long-term solutions, not just on this issue, but on many issues.
Exactly.
Even if it's not a quick fix, to some of the affordability issues around food. Jamie, what stood out to you as you were listening to the Prime Minister there?
Yeah, I guess two things, JP. First, on the announcement today, I think it actually is just really a scathing indictment of the failure of the Competition Bureau to actually put consumers' interests first in this country and maintain real competition. You heard the Prime Minister say that I think it was 80% of people shop at one of the big five chains and that they have controlled the supply chain up and down the market. And that obviously means Canadians are paying more. So we'll see what this comes. I'm lucky I live in downtown Toronto, and there is actually a really vibrant secondary market, especially with the Asian grocers. And prices regularly better, but that's not something that Canadians have access to across the country. And so hopefully today's announcement will seed some of that competition for the future. And hopefully it also leads to reform with the Competition Bureau to actually put Canadian consumers at the heart of these decisions, as opposed to having lobbyists kind of dictate let's go along. Here's a net benefits job for Canada. On the bigger stuff, for the Canada-US stuff that stood out to me, it seems like this was a communication strategy for the Prime Minister to try and not make news. He was trying to be incredibly boring, tamp down any animosity that could be misconstrued, and to play for time as he tries to figure out where the administration's going on this. Of course, we continue to see the president say this week, musing that he doesn't want a trade agreement at all, while his ambassador was here saying, actually, it's a negotiating tactic. It's time to make a deal, come back to the table. And so I think there's going to continue to be a lot of bluster that drives headlines on this. But when you hear Prime Minister Carney speak about this today, he really seemed to be going out of his way to take any animosity and energy out of being interesting on this as a way of tampering down expectations to not drive headlines and let negotiations take place at the table.
Yeah, Shachi, obviously we were all consumed by that comment yesterday from the president when he says, I don't know about renewing CUSMA. I don't think I'm going to do it, frankly. And that was, kind of a panic mode for some folks who are watching this keenly. But obviously, Prime Minister Mark Carney does not feel that way. If we are to interpret his remarks, at least what he said today, he feels like there has been some progress made on this file. And we know that, in fact, there actually has been some concrete things achieved. Dominic LeBlanc went to Washington last week. They sorted through 12 issues that were outstanding on a list of 36, if our sources are giving us the good stuff here. So it seems like there has been some progress, right? Like, it's not as if this is not an administration that is acting solely as if they want to walk away, Shachi, right? I mean, Jameson Greer, the U.S. trade representative, is sitting down with Dominic LeBlanc. They're working through some very meaningful things. We get the bluster from the president, but really the machinery of government in the United States is working towards a possible renewal. How do you interpret what we heard from the president and maybe the Prime Minister's comments today on what we heard from him?
Well, and add to that what we heard from the ambassador today. I spent most of my day at the Canada-U.S. Eurasia Summit, which is next door to this newsroom, listening to Ambassador Hoekstra going back to saying nicer things as opposed to nasty things, listening to Minister LeBlanc. Can I just say, at the risk of, maybe blowing up the point of this segment, but we all, the collective we and the chattering classes and the political classes, spend so much time, for good reason, just, waiting on the next words to come out of anybody's mouth on any given day, when in fact the bigger issue for Canadians, so this comes down to the real gap or juxtaposition in terms of priorities, right? The Prime Minister comes out and does this announcement on food. In a country where food inflation, Canada's food inflation is the highest among the group of 7 countries, where 5 retailers dominate 75% of the food market market, to Jamie's point, where you can be in Europe and buy a packet of ginger snaps. I know we're supposed to all be focusing on protein, but everybody has their weaknesses. In London, you get a pack of them for 98p. Add in the currency exchange, you're still paying almost double that in Canada for a similar amount of bloody ginger cookies. So when Canadians are telling me, 44% of them are telling me that they are having a hard time meeting their grocery bill on any given shop day. The ins and outs and the will they, won't theys, and is there progress, isn't there progress around CUSMA really does take a back seat in terms of what's a priority right now for a lot of Canadians. And so what that does is it actually creates a situation where maybe not the Prime Minister himself, but a lot of folks in government are very, very focused on trade. Again, not suggesting for a second that that's unimportant, but where a lot of Canadians are not is on that file. In fact, I've just looked at some data that's going to be out in a few hours that shows that the number of Canadians identifying the Canada-U.S. relations / trade issue is way, way lower, maybe a fourth or a third of where it was, 6-8 months ago. So, we're in this moment where we're spending a lot of time talking about bridge openings. We're spending a lot of time talking about incremental progress or non-progress, or what might happen in a meeting between the Prime Minister and the President at the G7, when really the priority for government and the areas that are being identified as not being met or delivered on for this government by Canadians continues to be cost of living, cost of food, cost of housing. So, he's trying to do it all to his credit, and I'm not one to sort of bring up talking points, but I think this food announcement, if it works, is probably actually a lot more relevant to a lot more people in this country than this discussion on trade right now.
Yeah, fair enough. I take your point, Shachi, but we're talking, Andrew, about a trading relationship where $644 billion worth of Canadian goods went to the U.S. last year, right? That's what's on the line here. I mean, this is why folks are concerned. When you look at our exports, we don't have to remind folks at home. They know these figures by now. 70% go to the U.S. market, right? We are so dependent on it. That's why government seized with it. That's why we're talking about it today, because so many jobs, so many people's livelihoods are dependent on the Americans. But I take the point, the cost of living also a major concern. Andrew, when you hear the U.S. Ambassador to Canada, P. Hoekstra, Shachi mentioned this summit this morning, he was trying to reframe the president's dismissal of CUSMA yesterday, saying really what he's up to is this is some sort of negotiation tactic. He says, what we're actually trying to get out of Canada is a better deal. He says, make us an offer. He wants, Trump wants Canada to come to him with some things that maybe we can offer, dangle in front of him to get CUSMA across the finish line, essentially suggesting to my ears that we need to make more concessions, right? That we have to be willing to give up even more than we have to this point. Andrew, did you hear Hoekstra? What's your take on it? And are you concerned about the state of the relationship when you hear him framing it in those terms?
Well, sure. I think that there's an issue. I mean, one of the reasons we talk about this so much is because of the volatility on the file. It's not one that moves in a nice linear fashion. There's a lot of surprises. It depends a lot on personalities. One of the people, though, that I think has neither served the American nor Canadian sides particularly well is the U.S. ambassador. I don't think he is really one of the people that's at the table or in the room. I'm not really sure he has a very good grip at all in terms of what the administration's driving at. Although there's no doubt that he kind of reflects a little bit of the Trumpian perspective, that if you just give the president what he wants, a little bit more of a slap on the back, that he will move over to your side. Of course, we know that that's not true. This tactic has been tried. We've tried bending to the American agenda with very little success on issues around national security, border security. None of this, all this has resulted in is another set of moving the goalposts. What I thought was interesting today is that the Prime Minister seemed more inclined to say that, we can wait. That NAFTA CUSMA doesn't end on July 1. It moves into a different phase. Of course, it continues on for 10 more years. So there's a runway here, and the Prime Minister, I think, was seeming to indicate that we're prepared to wait for a good deal. and just see as some of these other pieces in the United States click into place. Now, it's also quite possible that the American president, that Trump really is looking at what a mess he's made of things in the last year and a bit, and is maybe deciding he doesn't need to have this Canadian issue sitting there as a problem with border state Republicans and sitting as a potential disruptor around inflation, food inflation and other issues, energy security, all issues that are much more kind of topical and political in the United States. So it is possible that maybe Trump is softening, maybe he does want some kind of a deal and is looking for a way to get there. But frankly, given the inability for Trump to follow a line of reasoning, to be able to pursue a path that is in any way predictable, I think makes it very, very tough for Canada in any serious way to start looking at tilting in any different direction than what is absolutely in our bottom line best interest.
Michelle, what did you think when you heard Hoekstra today saying, what we really want is for you to make us an offer? I mean, Carney addressed that actually today. He said, we have put some very good offers in front of the Americans, but it's a negotiation. So I guess he's suggesting there that this is what Trump does, right? He kind of plays hardball, at least in public, talking tough. Hoekstra's kind of his guy in Canada who's doing the same thing. Do you feel anxious? Do you feel nervous when you hear Trump say, I'm not going to renew it? Or does Carney kind of soften the blow when he says, hang on, we'll get there?
Well, I don't think there's anything that that Trump says anymore that shocks me or makes me believe that that's a firm position one way or the other, really. But what I will say is I think it's the other part of Hoekstra's remarks that were actually more insightful, where he was talking about the fact that he knows that the U.S. needs other countries, that they need Canada. They prefer to be Canada. Certainly he mentioned potash. He certainly mentioned energy. Clearly, that's a huge part of our exports. But he also said, we want Canadians to come and buy our alcohol and to come to the U.S. again. So
a bit of a shift, maybe a little tonal shift.
It is the first time that in any way he that I heard that he actually acknowledged that it's a reciprocal relationship.
Yeah.
And that, yes, there are so many jobs and it is incredibly important and oversized importance in our economy, but it is very important to the U.S. economy as well.
Yeah.
We are their biggest customer. Let's not forget that. And they are clearly feeling the pinch when Canadians we've all spent a much colder winter this year probably, or many of us, and not gone down to the southern states. And so, I think that is probably just a bit of an evolution of thinking, and who knows how they're posturing and whatever. I think, quite frankly, Mr. Trump has a whole lot of other things on his mind that he is placing of higher importance in the next few weeks.
We talked about the bridge. Let's just play a little clip montage here because there's been, the Prime Minister says there's no drama or no major drama on this, but there has been a fair bit of drama over this Gordie Howe international bridge between Canada and the U.S. Let's have a listen.
It's positive news. Obviously, the bridge will be open at the end of the week, and a symbol, but also a fact of cooperation between our countries.
Well, let's see if it opens or not. Hopefully, it will. If they say it's going to open, I'm just hearing two stories.
Everyone's working hard to make sure the bridge is open as soon as possible. There's no big drama. If it takes a little longer, it'll take a little longer.
There was a decision to delay the opening, which may have happened as early as tomorrow. We have a few remaining issues that we want to work through with the United States.
Jamie, what do you make of this shifting narrative around the bridge and then the decision today to delay it entirely, for now at least?
Yeah, it sounds like there was an actual plan for it to open this week, and politics is what's driving this. We know that the owner of the Ambassador Bridge continues to lobby the Trump administration heavily to keep the new bridge, the Gordie Howe Bridge, closed. And we know the president is kind of way that he doesn't want this at all and kind of doesn't even have the basic facts of this right. This is a bridge that Canada has paid for that'll be co-owned by the state of Michigan and the federal government here in Canada. And so we'll ultimately have to see where this goes. This is 100% politics holding this up. But when we talk about grocery affordability and the kind of rest of the state of the relationship and all this, JP, I think one of the big things that's kind of curious to me that it's been absent from the conversation in recent weeks is supply management. If you want to increase the number of farmers who make Canadian agricultural goods, how about we stop artificially constraining the number of Canadians who can open farms in supply managed deals? If you want to have the expansion of international quotas to be able to import more lower cost food to help bring the price down for Canadians, let's expand those quotas and give up more market access. I think this is something that needs to be looked at, especially in light of the Prime Minister's announcement today on grocery affordability and wanting to have more Canadian farmers making more Canadian products to sell to Canadians and abroad.
Shachi, does that come up in your polling, supply management? I mean, we just went kind of left. We threw us for a loop there, Jamie, but...
No, I can speak to this.
Yeah,
Jamie,
okay, speak to it. I knew you'd have
you
something to say.
The fact is that Canadians were with Jamie until Trump turned this into a trade issue. So we've looked at this a lot. And there's two kinds of polls when it comes to supply management. There's the kind of polling we do that isn't paid for by the dairy or the supplier industry that shows that Canadians they're fine buying imported butter or cheese at a lower price if it gave them more choice and more options, especially at this time when food is so expensive. Here's the thing. As soon as Trump put it on the table, as soon as he started talking about it, that elbows up mentality took hold. It became part of that conversation. And all of a sudden, the data that we saw and started to note where it comes to Canadians and supply management, we're all about, oh, Trump doesn't want this, fine. This, folks, these eggs are the hill we're going to die on. And so I think, Jamie, I'm sorry, up until the point that Trump keeps talking about this, I don't think we're going to see much movement on it. It was always going to be a difficult one to move any federal government on because of the intense lobbying and politics around it. But certainly not going to see much movement on it as long as Trump keeps talking about it from a Canadian context.
Andrew, final word to you on eggs, dairy, bridges, whatever you want.
Well, a couple of things. I mean, Jamie's saying, very politically correctly that this is about allowing more Canadians to compete. Of course, that's not, in fact, how the opening of the supply management will work. And we have seen the inherent risk of allowing those kind of regulations to slip, even this week with the drama around the flesh-eating screwworm coming back into American cattle as a result of them opening the borders to Argentine beef. Live cattle imports. And so, there's a complex set of issues. One of the things I liked about the Liberal policy today is it does deal with some of those complexities. It is a very, what has happened over the last 20 or 30 years in the Canadian grocery supply chain is problematic. I'll just, say I was talking to a farmer in January who has a mixed operation just south of Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. And I asked him, why are beef prices so high? And he said, well, it's not that we're making the money off of it. He said one of the big problems, in fact, that they have is the lack of access to small and independent abattoirs, because so much of the meat processing is controlled by the big companies. They're not able to get in at a reasonable price. And so it's that kind of competition that's really kind of been missing all throughout the supply chain that is affecting both farmers, it's affecting consumers, it's really working to the advantage of the big industries that are now running our food security system. So it's more than just opening it up through dealing with the supply management issues. And I think that that's one of the things that was refreshing about the Carney government's announcement today is that it is actually taking a look at a whole bunch of these issues and realizing there's all sorts of issues that need to change if we are going to structurally start to see food prices come down.
Yeah, $1 billion for new food terminals across the country to better, accept exports, imports, what have you. $150 million for a food security fund to upgrade critical equipment to make more, store more, and bring more Canadian food to market. Something that wasn't necessarily on my radar, but obviously it is on the radar of the Prime Minister.